Thank you, Harvey. Many thanks to all my colleagues in organizing this. And these are tough acts to follow. So I don't have anything to show you. So today I'm going to talk about a particular part of the medieval city and the early modern city, which is the hospital. And I will start with an important story that keeps repeating a lot in many biographies of medieval physicians in the Islamic world. And this story is about the moment of choosing a site to build a hospital. The story goes that a famous physician was asked to choose a site or to help choose a site to build a hospital in Baghdad. And what he wanted to do is to choose the best place possible for this form of practice. What he did was that he asked his servants and his aides to take pieces of meat and hang them around the city and wait and observe these pieces of meat as they rot. And the place where the meat rots last will be the best place for the hospital to be built. The idea is based on the notion of miasms, which is an important part of the understanding of, or the medical theory that dominated this particular world, the Galenic medical theory. The idea is our diseases are caused by imbalances in our humors, and these imbalances in our humors can be caused in one way or another by problems in the miasms, which are the types of air around us. And in many cases, it's also built on an understanding that humans are essentially animals, and that we are largely made of the exact same matter that all other animals are made of. And therefore, if we take pieces of meat and wait for them to rot, the place where the meat will rot last will be the place with best miasms, and therefore will be the best place to build a hospital. This story never happened. And actually, the historians who kept saying or kept repeating this story always said that this story never happened. There's absolutely no evidence it ever happened. More importantly, the protagonist of the story, Al-Razi, is a very famous physician who was never involved with actually building a bimaristan or a hospital. The hospital which is supposedly the one that people are trying to build is usually Al-Bimaristan Al-Adudi, which was built in Baghdad about half a century after Razi's death. So it was really a story that brought the most famous physician in a relationship with choosing the site for the most famous hospital, and it was not true. However, it was always reported over and over again by all these historians, particularly the historians who were interested in the lives and the works of physicians. The story was in fact a dream of all these physicians of the moment when they get the chance to choose where the hospital should be built. They kept repeating it and saying it's wrong because it is not about the historical accuracy of the story. They were not interested in that. Everyone knew it's a myth, but they wanted everyone who reads to know that this is really the right way to build a hospital. You choose the place where it is the best for all these patients to be in. But this is not the way hospitals were built, and this is not the way sites of hospitals were built. There were other ways. One of these ways, for instance, is to choose the places where you are closest to your patients. And in these hospitals, all of which are charitable organizations, which are essentially were made and created in order to care for the poor, the patient, the sick poor, there was the idea of building hospitals close to the poor. In fact, we see stories of physicians who would take some of their students, take a cabinet of medicines, and go to suburbs that are known to be very poor and essentially set up an impromptu hospital there and practice until these people are cured. Not only that, we have accounts as well of physicians who take their students and their colleagues and go to prisons in order to serve people in the prison, setting up essentially a hospital in these prisons. The idea is that these poor are the ones who the hospital wants to serve, and in order to provide this best service, you take the hospital to them. However, hospitals were not built like that either. These are very rare examples. Normally, examples of clinics, small practices that are taken to places, but hospitals, the big hospitals of the medieval world, were not built close to the patients, were not built close to the place where the best medical practice could be made. They were built as monuments for particular founders and as monuments for particular moments in history. The hospitals were largely built in the center of the city. They were built in the center of the city not because the poorest lived there. On the contrary, the poorest lived far away outside the city. It was not because this is the best place where you can build something. On the contrary, this is probably the lowest place in the city being in many cases surrounded by mountains, for instance, and therefore this is actually the worst areas in the city could be in the center. But it is built there because building a monument is in itself an act of violence and violation. It's an act that transforms the structure of the city by erasing something and building something in its place. And by this act of erasure and recreation of a particular part of the city, there is a new ritual act of remembrance that gets to be created around the monument. The monument stands as a site for people to remember. And the people who are supposed to remember are the ones who matter the most, the ones who live in the center of the city. These are the ones who are supposed to remember those who build the hospitals. And those who built the hospitals had in mind the idea of building monuments that would not only carry their names for centuries after centuries, but more importantly, that would interrupt, that would stop people. And because this act of interruption would make people think. But in doing so, they ended up not only erasing one monument and building one another. And of course, when you have cities, when you have very complex and cities with very long history, where you want to build a hospital, there's really no empty lot there. You have to demolish something. You have to remove a building and build your hospital in its place. And the choice of what to remove and where to build the hospital is not really, again, a choice about the poor or a choice about medicine, but it's really a choice about what to forget and what to remember. We want to forget something. We erase something and build something else that is built for us to remember. But then, as they do that, something else emerges in this new city. It becomes a new city by this act. And this new city starts to acquire a different character because there is different movement. Now suddenly all these people who used to stay outside, sick, taken care of probably by friends, neighbors, or family, or sometimes by absolutely no one, left outside, now they make their journey in. The city changes because the patterns of movement where people know the city start to change. Cities are not necessarily known when we look at them from the air because people didn't look at their cities from the top. They looked at their cities from the streets. And the city changes by the manner in which people change their style of movement. They move differently. They go to different places. The hospital in the center of the city becomes a very significant part of the city because essentially it changes everything. New people are coming, new faces, new patterns, new habits of worship. All these things are coming inside, in many cases violating the very rich center of the city where the hospital was built in order for these builders to be, or these founders to be remembered. But as the hospital starts to build or is being built inside the city, it's not only something that changes the city, but it's the product of the city itself. Throughout my study of history of hospitals, that extended really, I studied hospitals around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East for over quite a span of time. And the most important thing about most of these hospitals in late antiquity and in the medieval world is that they are largely urban institutions. There are no hospitals in villages. They just don't exist. They are urban institutions. Why? Because in many cases they are built for a specific audience that is the product of the city. As David was explaining, the idea of the city creating these stratifications, the presence of the new urban poor that is created in the making of the city, these are the subjects of the hospital. These are the people who the hospital has to function on in order to be an effective institution and in order for the hospital to actually perform its role, its medical role, its charitable role, and its role as a monument. The urban poor is a specific type of poor. It's a poor that can be seen as different from the rest. a poor that is necessarily divorced and removed from longer and deeper family relations that existed in the rural community. The city is not organized around families. At least the medieval city in the Middle East is not organized around families. It is organized around professions. People live in a particular place because they work or they do something in particular. And depending on the profitability of what they do, the site that they live in gets to be closer or removed away from the center, and it gets to be richer or poorer. People are organized around a different type of belonging that makes them attached to one another away from older and traditional ways of belonging that link them together, like, for instance, family structures. Now, the urban poor are the ones who live far removed from the center, the one who occupy positions and jobs that are very much precarious. They can lose their jobs very easily. They sell very simple things that a lot of people can just live without. They do not have these major and most important jobs. They are the ones who are also subject to a lot of epidemics, and they are the ones who will suffer first in cases of famines. And why would they suffer in cases of epidemics before anyone else? Because as the city is making them through recreating their relationships to one another, it is also making their susceptibility to diseases by creating better water and better sewage in the center and worse services in the periphery. The city is making the poor, and in many ways making the poor poorer, and making the poor more dependent on the existence of the charitable organizations that come to be really what define the city. At least the medieval city. The medieval city here becomes centered around these hospitals, these water fountains, these kitchens, public kitchens, these hostels that host people. All these sites become at the center of the city, essentially, and through movement, bringing the entire city together by bringing and attracting all these people in the periphery to the center. As cities develop, they also become places for visitation. People visit cities. And as people visit cities, cities come to form networks. You go to places to learn, or you go to worship, you go for pilgrimages, or you go for trade, all sorts of purposes that connect people from one city to another and that allow or force people to move from one place to another. But as you move from one place to another, you get essentially to be in this new category that is disconnected from family, that requires care, that is also poor. Another type of urban poor that is based on the travel and the spread of travel. The centers of the city and these charitable organizations, including the hospital, are not only connecting every single city in its own different parts, but they become knots of contact that connect all these different cities into a network of connections. Because people travel to these places. Because when you travel, you'll go to the charitable kitchen and you'll go to the charitable hospital, and in many cases, you will end up inside the hospital. And in that case, the hospital, the kitchen, the charitable organizations, many of which were organized around religious organizations, all these hospitals become in many ways sites for this city to come together and for all these networks of cities to come together. But also because of this form of network and connection, we find a stratification of cities, again, as David explained. The idea that not all cities have similar hospitals, not all cities have similar charitable organizations, not all cities are able to host and to serve its own poor. In many cases, you can leave your own city and go to another place to attend these particular organizations, which become essentially a way of showing or of symbolizing how a particular city is bigger, richer, and more important than others. There's another interesting example of hospitals in the medieval world. And this example is rooted not only in the urban structure, not necessarily in the urban structure, but rather in another form of structure and of essentially belonging to something that existed across different structures. It's the pilgrimage hospital. The most famous of these pilgrimage hospitals are the hospitals that are built by the Hospitaller order during the medieval period. The whole idea of building hospitals everywhere, of providing hospitality to pilgrims, is that you actually trace the pilgrimage route and you put these hospitals and center on it. It's for the service of the pilgrim. But people working in these hospitals are always surprised by something very interesting, which is all these hospitals or houses of the hospitaller order, very small, but still located very far away from anything. They are not in any pilgrimage route. They are just somewhere in the middle of almost nowhere, just situated there, where a couple of brothers would stay and wait for pilgrims to come. But pilgrims never come, because no one comes to that place. People take the major routes. Why would you build a place here? The pilgrim that they are looking for is not the real one. It's a potential pilgrim. The existence of the route is what is important. And the hospital and the house become the place to define the existence of the route. They build hospitals in places where some pilgrim one day could pass. There is always the justification of building a pilgrimage house anywhere. It doesn't matter, because anywhere could, at one point in time, fall on a pilgrimage route. The hospitals of the Hospitaller order, which is again the largest and most significant example, but only one among many other examples, were forming together a network that would really survey a space for pilgrims to move, not necessarily the real pilgrims that we can count and we can see coming to Jerusalem, but in many cases, imagined pilgrims, potential pilgrims, that would one day make their way to these places. This is not an isolated phenomenon. Muslim powers were also building a lot of these houses and hospitals along the route to Mecca. The Byzantines were building houses that would lead to Jerusalem but also lead to Constantinople. This is a very repetitive phenomenon. And in all these cases, the idea was to mark the route with the hospital, to mark the route with these charitable institutions that would allow people to move from one place to another, but would also recognize how these people who are moving are now becoming part of an imagined community of urban poor. They look exactly like your urban poor. They don't have families. They don't have stable jobs. They actually have very little savings that could run away, that could run out. And in many cases, they are always susceptible to the dangers of the road and to the dangers of the city. The charitable institutions were born inside the urban settlement, in a way expressing the new citizenship or belonging to a city that is made not along family or tribal connections, but along largely a lot of economic and spiritual presence. Students, pilgrims, and workers were there in the city. And they were there because they were doing something. Now, in the vast majority of cases, these things that they were doing never ended. And the student's trip to a particular city came to be a lifetime migration. And this student would just spend the rest of his or her life in this new place. The idea is that these people who came to the urban center and created the social stratification of the urban center were now centered around a new place inside the city that housed all these charitable organizations that really not only catered to the poor, but also created them. Created them by defining the category of the deserving poor as opposed to the undeserving poor, by noticing who really deserves the charity and who does not. And in doing that, there is another layer of stratification, another layer that would send some people away. There is also other layers that are related, for instance, to religions, religious affiliations, sometimes to ethnicities that would allow some people into the charitable institution and others who are equally poor outside. They cannot be admitted. That charitable organization at the center of this particular medieval, late antique and medieval city was the nerve of this new city. And at the same time, it was making the city as it progresses. And when you take these hospitals and you spread them everywhere into pilgrimage routes, you're really creating more and more a larger image of this urban population that is devastated by its removal from larger and deeper traditional connections to other people and creating a sort of a larger global community of travelers or of pilgrims. None of them has any connection with one another except by the purpose of their particular trip. And in many cases, And throughout the history of these charitable institutions, the hospital being one example of them, we see how these cities come to create their own stratification by the size, the importance, and the ability of their institutions to survive over a longer time. I will stop here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.